Welcome back to Bad Books of the Bible. We took a couple weeks off for the holidays.
Yep.
Something went wrong. Please try again.
I'm Joel Miller.
And I'm Jamie Bennett.
And this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy.
We're nearing the end of First Maccabees, and so far the book has presented a relentless parade of actors and activity. Mm-hmm. And so given that, I think a recap might be in order.
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, we started off with a crisis. You know, all good stories do. This one also, the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV, he tries to strengthen his troubled kingdom by doing what else? Insisting that everyone under his reign embrace his way of doing things. Greek beliefs, Greek practices, and that would include worship. And of course, that puts us in a collision course with the main characters of our story, faithful Jews, because they would lose their cultural identity.
Sure. And to a Jew, there's nothing more important to their identity than the relationship with God,
right? And
the covenant that they have with him. And they consider themselves a special people in a special time and place.
Exactly.
These enemies put a continual threat to that.
The scholar Doran Mendels talks about three main social groups in the Seleucid world. There's Greeks like Antiochus, who dominated the Middle East following Alexander's conquest. Then there were the various native populations, all across that empire, but that would, of course, include the Jews of Judea,
right,
who found themselves under Greek rule. And then there were the Hellenists. These were locals who tried to synthesize both worlds, their local beliefs and practices, along with the Greek culture that was being pushed by the Seleucid rulers. And in fact, it's really the intersection of these three groups that provides the primary drama of the entire book of First Maccabees.
Yeah, really, it comes down to how they get along, or really rather how they don't get along,
Right, exactly.
So the story gets told from the perspective of locals, those who are faithful to their, traditional beliefs. The challenges primarily involve their Greek overlords, the Seleucids. Now, the Hellenizing Jews, as we've mentioned many times, they also play a role.
Sometimes they're called like renegades, and there's some derogatory language like that gets used to describe these folks in the story.
And they play mostly like the role of the spoilers. They're just complicating lives for the faithful Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Most of this book really involves direct confrontation with the Seleucids. Now, eventually, the book shifts away from these open confrontations, and the arrangement gets a little more complex. There are political deals going on with, various factions of the Seleucid Empire as it's fracturing.
Right.
Now, whether through the confrontation or some sort of, triangulation, really the end game all along was to secure enough freedom to worship their God in the Jerusalem temple as the faithful Jews were bound to do.
Right.
The crisis really begins in the story when Antiochus tries enforcing his program. And Mattathias of Modin, he just refuses. And instead, he leads a group of rebels, which includes his sons, to oppose the Seleucids.
And those sons, as we've encountered them already, are Judas Maccabeus, whose sobriquet ends up providing the title for this and the other Maccabean books. The name means the hammer.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan, who takes over after Judas is killed. And then finally, Simon, who takes over when Jonathan is feared dead. Each of these successive rulers gets the Jews a little closer to their goal of religious freedom. So with Judas, he's presented primarily as a warrior, like a military leader.
Mm-hmm.
And he does, in fact, lead his people against impossible odds time and time again. And ultimately, under his rule, they reclaimed the temple after Antiochus had defiled it. And that's when they inaugurate the holiday of rededication known as Hanukkah. So like Judas's reign, that's what he does. He like gets them a little bit closer to the goal. He at least gets the temple back.
Yeah.
But they're still under Seleucid control. Jonathan steps in at that point and adds diplomacy and some political gamesmanship to the mix.
Right.
Daniel Harrington, who is writing about this book, he refers to Jonathan's he says this about Jonathan: his political skill gave new life and direction to the Maccabean movement. And it really is a whole change in the flow of the book,
Sure.
in the dynamic of the way Israel is being led at this point. That's because when he takes over, he starts playing one Seleucid ruler off another.
Sure.
This guy's like, 3D chessing his way through the politics of this fracturing Greek empire. He ends up earning special status in the Seleucid Council. He becomes a friend of the king, which is a technical term. And he also ends up securing alliances with Rome and Sparta.
It's important to say that Jonathan is not really a slouch on the battlefield either.
He's powerful.
He really is. But when it comes down to it, his most important move was becoming high priest. And of course, this was also the result of very effective politicking. The former high priest, Alcimus, he died suddenly after ordering the removal of the inner wall of the temple sanctuary. This is a major transgression. Now, Alcimus was one of the Hellenizers, obviously, and he was trying to accommodate pagan Gentiles in the temple. A definite no-no too, Daffy.
Right, yeah.
Alcimus's death leaves a vacancy, and Jonathan fills it.
Yeah.
Thanks to the appointment of Alexander Bolus, the leader of one of the Seleucid factions. It's important to remember that Jonathan's father, Mattathias, was also a priest. So even though he wasn't in the current line that held the priesthood at the time, it really wasn't a stretch.
Yeah.
This, however, would become a major sticking point for many traditional Jews. Some of them eventually broke with the Maccabean rulers and formed this sort of passive resistance movement by the Dead Sea.
Yeah.
This is the community that wrote the scrolls preserved until the discovery in the middle of the last century. This is the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community we've mentioned multiple times.
But politics would ultimately become Jonathan's undoing. So despite the fact that he was a very artful practitioner, there's always somebody who's a little bit better than you. And the leader of one Seleucid faction, Trypho, he tricks Jonathan in a particular moment to reduce his armed guard and follow him to Ptolemais under the pretense of giving him the city. So Jonathan assumes that he is basically being awarded control of Ptolemais. He's already been awarded control of other cities, so this kind of makes sense. He doesn't realize, however, that he's walking right into a trap.
Yeah.
Trypho murders the guard that Jonathan has and then takes him captive. And this, of course, brings us ultimately now to Simon, whose story we pick up today. He turns out to be every bit the politician that his brother Jonathan was, but ultimately he was also more effective. Left off last time with the capture of Jonathan. Back home, everyone assumes he's dead. The narrator says that his people mourned him and that all the surrounding Gentiles saw this as an opportunity. So, here's a quote that the narrator provides. You can imagine these Gentiles rubbing their hands together in kind of a dastardly, sinister way, saying, "Now they have no leader or helper. Let us make war on them and wipe out their memory from the earth." Time after time, the faithful Jews in First Maccabees have faced existential disaster. They've been right on the precipice, and here we are again. Not surprisingly, given what we know about Trypho, he's the first Gentile aggressor to make a move.
Yeah, Simon hears that Trypho's assembled an army to invade Judah.
Yeah.
And it's not just Simon that hears this, right? Everybody has heard the news.
Yeah.
And people are afraid. Simon speaks to them. He wants to put away their fears. He says, "You yourselves know what great things my brothers and I and the house of my father have done for the laws and the sanctuary. You know also the wars and the difficulties that my brothers and I have seen. By reason of this, all my brothers have perished for the sake of Israel, and I alone am left. And now, far be it from me to spare my life in any time of distress, for I am not better than my brothers. But I will avenge my nation in the sanctuary and your wives and children, for all the nations have gathered together out of hatred to destroy us."
Wow.
So this is a rallying speech, and it really moves the people. The Navarre Bible says, "Not everyone in Jerusalem may have seen eye to eye with Jonathan in Simon's military enterprises in the service of Syria or the consequences they would have for the Jews. Therefore, Simon reminds them of the sacrifices that have been made, even at the cost of life itself, to defend the law in the temple. And he shows his determination to follow the course set by his fathers and brothers. Unsurprisingly, they declare Simon their leader.
Yep.
They're very moved by what he said, and they remember his brothers and his father. So they say to him, fight our battles, and all that you say to us, we will do. I was amused where the text actually says that they all said in a loud voice. You just get this impression that everybody is crying out and saying, Simon,
yeah,
where you go, we will go.
And where they first go is to war. Sure enough, Trypho arrives with his army, but he hears that Simon is ready for him. So instead of an attack, Trypho starts by making demands. Just imagine the gall of this guy.
Why not?
He claims that Jonathan owes money to the Seleucid treasury. Okay. Like, wait, what? First, he's still alive? That's good to know. Basically, it's kind of like a pay to play for the offices that he's been given by the Seleucid powers. So
right.
This is, like the price tag that apparently was not placed on the item when he purchased it at the store. But the Seleucids in the form of Trypho are now saying, he owes us all this money.
Yeah.
And until he forks it over, we're going to keep him captive. Now, Simon is smart enough to know that this is just a ruse, but he raises the money anyway. He doesn't want it to come back on him that like he somehow dealt negligently with the fate of his brother. But it's also not surprising that Trypho did not release Jonathan. Instead, he marched his army from camp to camp, trying to avoid encounters with Simon and his army. And, basically Simon like follows him around wherever his army goes, wherever Trypho's army goes, Simon's army goes.
Sure.
So they're just like dogging each other, throughout Judah, basically.
Yeah.
There's a funny little side story here, which is worth mentioning. The Acra, the citadel that the Seleucids built opposite
Can't forget about that.
of the temple. Exactly. Those guys have been walled in there now for a while. And, formerly they would have reported to Demetrius. Now they've heard that Trypho's on the move and they're like, hey, you got to bail us out.
Yeah.
But Trypho's men get bogged down in a snowstorm. Like they can't send food to the guys in the citadel in the Acra.
Right.
And instead, with this snowstorm, Trypho, he just runs out of his ability to maintain his current course. He kills Jonathan and retreats. So there's the end of the second Maccabean brother. Jonathan dies, and Simon goes and gathers his brother's body and buries him in a monumental grave in Modin, their family's hometown.
So it's funny. The text actually describes these monuments as like pyramids.
Right.
And when you read it, you might first think, oh, this is some giant pyramid, but no, that's not practical. That could not have been built in a short time. So what I immediately thought of is there's a cemetery in New Orleans where Nicolas Cage has controversially created his own future tomb with his family name on there, Coppola.
What?
And it's a small pyramid.
Oh, we're talking Raising Arizona, Nicolas Cage. We're talking National Treasure.
Yes.
Nicolas Cage.
Yes.
All right.
And so you're going through this beautiful historic cemetery, and there's all these, normal looking family tombs, above ground tombs. And then there's a pyramid, and it's like, what the heck is this thing? And it's Nicolas Cage's monument for when he dies.
Is that not the most Nicolas Cage thing you can imagine?
It's perfect.
Yeah, that's so great.
Meanwhile, back to our story. Trypho's scheming continues. Right? He killed young Antiochus. He places himself on the throne. Simon responds, of course, by fortifying Judah against any subsequent attacks. And he also reaches out to King Demetrius. Now, you might recall Trypho ran Demetrius off. Now, since then, he's maintained rule over basically a rump state, with hopes of regaining his entire kingdom. He's not going to give up yet. A rump state's not nothing, though. It was something that Simon could use to sort of triangulate against Trypho.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Now, Demetrius is happy for an ally. He says, we are ready to make a general peace with you and to write to our officials to grant you release from tribute. All the grants that we have made to you remain valid, and let the strongholds that you have built be your possession. Let there be peace between us. It's a big deal.
Yeah, the Navarre Bible, mentions this exemption from tribute and says that this is essentially equivalent of granting Judea full political independence, freeing them from the Gentile yoke that they've been under, that's kind of a big deal. So
it's huge.
We talked in the top of the show about the progressive freedom that Israel is experiencing through these successive rulers. Here is, for the first time, a notice in the text itself that something big is happening in terms of this level of political freedom, and that it's only going to get more cemented as we keep going.
The narrator comes in and says, in the 170th year, the yoke of the Gentiles was removed from Israel.
Wow.
And the people began to write in their documents and contracts in the first year of Simon, the great high priest and commander and leader of the Jews. If we wondered if it was a big deal before, now we know what a big deal it was to them.
Just to mention how big of a deal this was, they didn't have standardized calendars back then. The way you marked time was by where you sat in relationship to a significant ruler or some kind of significant personage. And Simon and what he has accomplished is so significant that they actually restart the calendar based on his rule right here.
The Navarre Bible translates this into our numbers and says it was about the year 142 BC.
Mm-hmm.
For a sense of the time scale of the book here, Antiochus plundered the temple back in 169 BC, and he built the citadel in the next year. So we're talking almost like 3 decades of struggle.
That's intense.
This is no small amount of time.
No. So far this book has sort of felt like just one dang battle after another, but just imagine this is transpired now over 30 years, nearly 30 years. It's kind of astonishing.
It really is.
Right off the bat, Simon achieves 3 important victories. First, he sent an army to take the city of Joppa, and then he went to Gazara. Now, recall from chapter 9, Maccabees, he's the Seleucid ruler who's kind of like, just mucking stuff up for the Maccabees.
He was a mess.
In that particular period, he built fortified cities and fortresses throughout Judea in order to complicate, life. One of those fortified cities was Gazara. So Simon decided it was time to take it back. He built a siege engine and battered his way into one of the towers. Now, a siege engine, we're talking here about like a mobile tower, which he was able to bring up to the wall of this city, into which he could load a large, invading group of men.
Sure.
They were able to bash their way into the tower and come through on the other side, storming into the city. Immediately, the townspeople, they give up, they surrender. They plead for mercy. And, in a moment that is very different than the rest of the book, Simon lets them live. Most of these Maccabean rulers have been, you might say, harsh on the people who are kind of in the way. And in this case, he's not harsh. It might strike us as a little bit harsh, but in retrospect, or compared to the rest of the book, he is incredibly lenient.
Right.
He lets them all leave, basically.
And they're quite literally invaders. So one could argue it is quite generous under the terms of war.
Under the terms of war, this is pretty generous. He lets them all leave. And he then cleanses the town and resettles faithful Jews there, allies of his own. And then he builds a house for himself. So that's kind of a big deal. He's like, this is now mine. But he wasn't done yet.
So Simon next tackles the citadel, right? This is the Acra, which has stood as an offense since nearly the beginning of the story. This thing comes up again and again. And this is in many ways the final climax of the book. This was easier to manage than what they had to deal with in Gazara.
Gazara.
Do
we know?
Gazara.
Gazara. I say it's Gazara.
Gazara. Jonathan's strategy to block the citadel from resupply, it actually works.
Yep.
People inside eventually are succumbing to starvation. I mean, look, if you can't get groceries, you can only last so long. Those still living realize that the end was upon them, and they're like, it is time to sue for peace.
Now, amazingly, just like with Gezerah, Simon accepts their offer and expels them from the citadel. So he doesn't slay every one of them or anything like that. He lets them all go.
Yeah.
And then he has the place cleansed, just like he had done for Gezerah. And then they threw a massive party to celebrate their victory.
At this point, Simon says that they should celebrate this moment annually as a festival. They established this annual feast, and according to the Navarre Bible, is the 4th of June, 141 BC, when they first celebrate it.
Wow.
And he builds a home for himself right there in the citadel.
That's a big deal. Like, this thing has been a sore spot in the story from the beginning of the book. And now Simon has built a home for himself in the middle of it. It is like that. This is, in a way, this is the end of the book. It's not exactly, we'll talk about that in a second, but this is the final climax has now been resolved. And the way in which it is resolved is like, I don't know how to say this exactly, but just kind of like beautifully pictured in the people who have been persecuted, establishing a home in the place of their persecutors. It's like, we have taken this back.
It takes a special man to turn a citadel into a home.
It does.
Well, meanwhile, Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, he has come of age. While Simon settles into his rule, he appoints John the commander of the army, and then he sends him to live in Gezerah. The narrator presents what appears to be a side note on Demetrius, and it says that he went looking for help in his war with Trypho, and in the process, he ends up getting captured by the king of the Persians.
Oops.
And he's placed under guard.
This turns out to be more than a side note. In fact, I think the reason it's in the book at all, because it's like, I mean, it's super anticlimactic. Who cares what happens to Demetrius at this point?
Sure.
Especially when basically he just gets arrested and that's the end. The reason this matters, essentially, this is a moment in which the political control of the Jews has finally come back to themselves. So they have religious autonomy now. They're back in their own temple. They have expunged the enemy from these various cities. They have cleansed them. We have Simon living at the citadel. And now finally they have political autonomy too, because the only real claim on them at this point is from the Seleucids, either faction, whether it's Trypho or Demetrius.
Yeah.
But the problem here is that Trypho's off dealing with his problems and Demetrius is now captured, which functionally means the Maccabees are free for the first time. And so this is the moment that we've kind of been leading up to all along, that we finally have an independent Judea. We finally have an independent Judah.
Yeah.
This has now taken nearly 30 years, but here we are. So the narrator moves on to praise Simon for this victory that he's attained, to eulogize him. There's this 12 verse long eulogy that's just stuck right here in the text. The first part praises his exploits, including the capture of Gezerah and the Acra. And the narrator says this: the land was at rest all the days of Simon. His rule delighted his people, and his glory all his days.
It's filled with rapturous praise, really.
Yeah.
And as Daniel Harrington points out, the second half echoes the first, but it actually borrows language from other biblical books. We've seen this borrowing of scriptural language throughout the book.
Yeah.
The narrator seems very conscious throughout that he's working within the tradition of biblical narrative.
Yeah.
He's self-consciously inserting characteristics of his heroes into the history of Israel's kings. The narrator says he strengthened all the lowly and was zealous for the law. Right. So over and over, he seems to be this idealized king.
Yeah.
And it concludes with a line that echoes King Solomon, as well as validating his own role as high priest, a role his brother Jonathan had attained. It says, the sanctuary he made splendid and multiplied its furnishings.
After this, now, the narrator has two lengthy passages that we can summarize pretty quickly. The first is renewed relationships with Sparta and Rome. Harrington points out that when there's a change in leadership, it was customary to renew alliances that were made in the past. So both kingdoms send letters.
Sure.
Sparta's features in this chapter. It's a formal acknowledgement of Simon's rule and his high priesthood. And then Rome's letter comes into play in the next chapter. We'll cover that next week. The second passage to summarize here is Judah's own acknowledgement of Simon and his line. That is the people's own acknowledgement of Simon and his line, especially John Hyrcanus.
Yeah.
According to the narrator, the people said, "How shall we thank Simon and his sons? For he and his brothers and the house of his father have stood firm. They have fought and repulsed Israel's enemies and established its freedom." But the answer to how they'll do it is they're going to commemorate these actions on bronze plaques and place them on the pillars of Mount Zion. So
wow.
These guys are being elevated basically as high as they can be, and their rule is going to be confirmed in what is basically a constitution.
Importantly, of course, this includes political, military, and high priestly rule.
Mm-hmm.
And these tablets recount some of the same deeds of the eulogy, but they put them in prose rather than in poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So some snippets we can look at. Like it says, Simon, son of Mattathias, a priest of the sons of Joarib, and his brothers exposed themselves to danger and resisted the enemies of their nation in order that their sanctuary and the law might be preserved. And they brought great glory to their nation.
It says, the people saw Simon's faithfulness and the glory that he had resolved to win for his nation, and they made him their leader and high priest, because he had done all these things and because of the justice and loyalty that he had maintained toward his nation.
Another one here. In view of these things, King Demetrius confirmed him in the high priesthood, made him one of his friends, and paid him high honors.
It says, the Jews and their priests had resolved that Simon should be their leader and high priest forever until a trustworthy prophet should arise. And that last bit, I think, is important because there is a recognition here that the way Simon and the rest of what becomes the Hasmonean dynasty comes to power is a little unconventional.
Yeah.
Normally a king is ordained by a prophet, is appointed by a prophet. There is no prophet at this time. And so this rule comes through lots of different validation, but not the validation of a prophet. And so the assumption is that somebody like that may still come along.
Sure.
In the meantime, it's been, his rule has been acknowledged by Sparta. It's been acknowledged by Rome. It's been acknowledged by Demetrius. It's been acknowledged by the Jewish people themselves. And so there's an argument being made here that's clear that these guys have the right to rule. These guys are rightful in their reign for now. But that for now is important because the assumption is that somebody who has an even greater claim to the throne of Israel will arise potentially in the future.
And when we consider as Christians what you just said, it's hard for us not to conclude that hope was fulfilled in the person and work of Jesus Christ in short order after the time of the Maccabees.
Yeah.
The narrator tells us at this point that Simon does accept and agree to be the high priest. And this actually makes him, according to the text, the commander and ethnarch of the Jews and priests to be protector of them all.
Mm-hmm.
It's a special designation for this particular people within this larger arrangement.
So let's go back to the beginning. When the book begins, we have Alexander the Great storming across the known world and just, raking up kingdoms. One of his followers, his successors, is Antiochus IV. And he, as his kingdom is falling apart, decides to shore it up the only way he knows how, which is this assimilation, this kind of enforced Hellenization of the various peoples under his kingdom, which include the Jews. And you have arising out of the people these heroes, Mattathias, and then Judas, and then Jonathan, and then finally Simon. And it's through these leaders that Israel gains its freedom, not only its political autonomy, but most especially its religious autonomy.
Yeah.
And, there's some details to address throughout the rest of this book. There's 2 more chapters coming, but the primary action is over. We have now seen Israel under intense danger, under existential threat, under a total calamity,
right,
and come out the other side whole. And that is the story of the Maccabees.
The story of this book, and the story of all of the books we cover here on Bad Books of the Bible, presses on week after week, with an occasional break for personal refreshment, holidays, and other such things. If you don't want to miss a single beat of these stories, be sure to sign up at badbooksofthebible.com for our Substack, which is an email list and a nice little blog type site. We say all the things there that we say here, just differently. I'm Jamie Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
You've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
a production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week when we wrap up the narrative of First Maccabees.